When we talk about acquisition, that's the process and steps by which our potential audience, so people who have not been familiar with us, who have not visited our digital properties before, become loyal audience. This funnel is really only for our digital audience. We're not talking about the world of broadcast. So when we say that they're new, they may be a lifelong broadcast listener, but they may be new to our digital properties. So we're going to narrow in on that. Segmentation is grouping our audience by behaviors or characteristics that are going to help us to better understand them. So moving from kind of this one blob of people of all different types and grouping them into really clear, distinct segments that we can use to better understand what's going on. So if we think about this funnel and segmentation coming together, it helps us to understand how different users at different points in the funnel behave differently. And once we understand how they behave differently, we can discover tools for encouraging these users to move through the funnel. Once they've gone from potential audience to new audience, how do we get them all the way to being loyal and engaged audience? So our first step was actually to define the funnel. And it's a pretty simple funnel. We actually had talked about this a bit before. And in our initial conversations, there was the idea that the bottom of the funnel should be membership. And what we realized is that members are really kind of over here. You can be new digital audience or loyal digital audience and be a member. Those things actually don't directly relate in a straight line. So I like to think of it this way. Our members are the ooey gooey delicious core that cuts through all of those layers of the funnel. And I think Ben & Jerry's makes it really wonderful and yummy. So here's the definitions that we have. These are preliminary definitions, and we do think that these may adapt over time as we understand a little bit better. But we found that these have worked pretty well. So we have our new and infrequent visitors. So these are either the first visit or we want to dump them actually back into new if we feel like it's been too long for them to have really proceeded in that funnel. So visitors who have not been to the site in over 90 days. The next bucket are repeat visitors, are people who are not in their first visit, but also haven't yet crossed that threshold for what we would consider loyal. So less than their 10th visit. And then for loyal visitors, this is anyone with 10 or more visits ever. So it may have taken them 2 years to get to 10, but their last visit was less than 7 days ago. So the idea being that we have not only a minimum interaction target, but we also have a recency target around this as well. Once we define these segments, we actually can look through and try to understand better or validate these segments by understanding the differences in behaviors. And what we found when we just talk about, and this is looking at a 6-month period of time and then averaging those monthly numbers. So from October through March in the station roll-up, we found that new visitors are actually the largest driver of our sessions, of our overall traffic. New visits are 58% of our average monthly visits or sessions. I'm going to note that I'm trying to use the terms users and sessions because Google has recently switched their vocabulary from visits and visitors to users and sessions. I apologize if I go back and forth between those terms. But our new visitors are driving the majority of our visits. But we have not insignificant contributions from both the repeat and loyal categories. I will note that there's 9%. These are folks who didn't quite fit into our buckets. One of the reasons for this is that when you're doing visitor segmentation, sometimes the visits that are associated with the people don't always fall neatly into the buckets because there's kind of a straddling that can happen. This model currently leaves about 9% of our visits kind of unspoken for. So we'll work to tune that as well. Is that our loyal visitors are a very small audience segment in terms of uniques or people, but they have a much bigger contribution to our visits than the people that they represent. So loyal is actually more visits than repeat, but you can see that it's actually far less users, far less unique individuals. So we went through and we validated, once we kind of understand what these different groups were, we wanted to understand if they were behaving differently. So again, we're looking at the SaaS roll-up here, monthly averages over the past 6 months. And what we found was there are some some clear differences going on here in terms of pages per session. So if we think about engagement at a session level as how much content is an individual viewing within the context of that session, we see that there's actually a steady increase as loyalty increases, consumption increases, even within a given session. So new visitors are consuming closer to 1.5 pages, where our loyal visitors are consuming over 2 pages. And that repeat seems to be nicely in the middle there. So we see this kind of validates the idea that there is a path. What gets really interesting is that our loyal visitors, that may actually be an understatement. They are very loyal and actually have the highest sessions per user. They're averaging almost 15 sessions a month per person, compared to new visits, which is 1, because you're only in that new bucket for that 1 visit in the month, and repeats, which are somewhere around 1.43. So they're doing a little bit more than 1 session, but not anywhere near what we see in terms of those loyal visitors. So this combines to an aggregate metric of consumption that loyal visitors are actually seeing 33.5 pages of content per month per person, compared to just 1.6 for new visitors, compared to just under 3 for repeat. Really, really clear differences here. So that small group is actually consuming quite a lot of content and information. So now that we know that they're consuming more, I think it becomes really clear that we want to ask, what exactly is it that they're consuming? What's driving them to the site? What are they looking for? So when we look at our streaming behavior, and we look at the percentage of sessions that include some sort of streaming, either a page or an event that indicates that they've interacted with streams, we see that loyal visitors are 5 times more likely to stream than new visitors. So these new sessions, only 6% of the time are they engaging with streams, whereas loyal visitors, those people who are coming back 15 times a month, 32% of the time they're doing it to interact with a stream. And we're seeing that repeat bucket kind of fall nicely in the middle there, indicating that that progress trends towards that recency and frequency. When we flip that, we actually find out that our new visitors are 3 times more likely to read a story than our loyal visitors. So what's attracting, again, that new audience, this really confirms for us that written content works as an acquisition tool. Stories are getting people to the site. Those new people are coming in because they're reading this content, they're seeing it on social media, they're finding it on search. But the loyal visitors are actually less likely to be engaging with that written material. And again, as I mentioned, repeat audience and new users are actually similarly likely to use social media to be acquired through those social media channels, where loyal audience tends to be less likely to be responding to a social media prompt. Only 9% of our loyal audience comes in from a social media network, whereas over 20% of new and repeat are coming in that way. Not shocking, I think, to see that loyal visitors are actually the most likely to visit the site directly. So they have that relationship. They're either bookmarking a page or they're typing in a URL directly and they're accessing the site that way, 31% of the time, compared to 27% for our new visitors. I wanted to point out that I think when we first see that almost 30% of new traffic comes in direct, that seems a little interesting. If these people are truly new, why is it that they're coming in from either a bookmark or from a directly typed URL? Some of this may be new devices, but I think one of the other important things to realize is that, again, this is a digital funnel. So it's not that they've never heard of your station. It's just that they haven't visited the property before. So what's a logical place where people would hear about your website and type it in directly? They're probably responding to on-air prompts. And we see that Pledge Drive is actually a place where this can happen a lot. If you are actively encouraging on air for people to go to the website in order to make their pledge transaction, that's a good scenario for where we would see direct traffic coming in from people who had not used the website before. So to recap what we've learned so far, our new visitors, they're the largest driver of our traffic. They see the least content in terms of pages, with just an average about 1.6 pages per visit. They're also the least likely to stream, but they're the most likely to read content. And we see that they respond to social media. We're going to skip talking about the repeat visitors because in general, they tend to be kind of in between. They are like new visitors in some ways. They're trending towards being more like the loyal visitors in other ways. But the real distinction is our loyal visitors. So we've talked about this before that, there is kind of a core audience that is very loyal, that is very steady. Their usage patterns, when we look at their interaction with streaming over time, there's not spikes like we see in the reading behavior. We see huge spikes in traffic that are driven by social media, that are driven by news stories, that are driven in all of that interest. Whereas our streaming traffic, if you were to segment by streamers and look at that over time, you'll see that it's a very regular kind of increases during the week, decreases on the weekends, very predictable pattern. So we do need to be thinking about these visitors, even though they are a smaller group. We do need to be thinking about them as we're developing. Again, they consume the most content per session. They return most frequently. They're most likely to be streaming. When we get better metrics on our engagement with inline audio and on-demand pieces, I think we may see some interesting behaviors here as well. And they're least likely to read content. So there may be things that we can do to expand our treatment, expand our streaming pages so that we can encourage them to engage with the written content where it's appropriate. Or we may want to develop an experience that's really tailored to their primary focus, which is listening and audio rather than reading. And I think we've seen some indications kind of anecdotally that there tends to be differences, fundamental differences in people and their preferences for how they consume the content. And we may not be able to encourage everyone to be a streamer, but we can start developing around that. So what do we want to learn next? I have a whole list of questions, and these are all kind of things that just kind of float off the top of my head. So this is by no means the only things that we're going to be looking at. But we want to understand, actually, if we encourage a new visitor to stream, are they then more likely to return? We want to know how long it actually takes someone to move from being a new visitor to being a loyal visitor. Is that a process that happens over a week, over a month, over a year? Right now, it's very difficult to understand that from the current tracking in Google Analytics. We want to know if there are behaviors that predict whether or not a new visitor is actually going to become a loyal visitor. And above all, I think we want to customize our treatment of our audience to those groups so that we can use that information to encourage membership and encourage engagement. So our next step becomes implementing custom tracking. So we know Google Analytics segments actually don't preserve history to show the progress over time. And what we really want to see is how people move from one group to another. And more specifically, when do they move? Is it the day that they first click on a stream that they become a loyal visitor? Or are there things that are probably less expected that we can identify? So if you've ever looked at your new and returning visitors and been confused to see a new visit appear in your returning visitor bucket, it's because of this way that Google segments, that it is very much kind of based on the last action that they performed. So once someone comes for their second visit, the visitor type becomes returning, even if the visit was a new visit. So we want to get around that. And to do that, we're designing custom tracking for all of our SaaS stations. This will be part of the TMS, so it will be embedded in there, and it will help us to better identify when users move between the segments so that we can understand the causes, the triggers for that. So we don't yet have a timeline. We're actually just scoping out what exactly we need to track that, but we talk every month, so I'm sure I'll be sharing updates with you on an ongoing basis. And I have not yet looked at the questions that were popping up, but I think it would be reasonable to assume that you're curious about how can you use these segments to look at your audience on your site. And actually, we are lucky that segment definitions can be shared across Google Analytics. They can be added to your own account. So we're going to send out links to those segment definitions. So you'll be able to click on them and import them directly into your Google Analytics account.